My Christian parents raised me to believe that there was one God, and that everything he did was good. My parents taught me, as the old hymn goes, Christian children all should be kind, obedient, good as he. In this introductory morality video, I'm going to briefly touch upon how insidious a belief in biblical morality and instruction is, and how it can affect real families today. I was taught in church that God had a plan for my life, and that as a Christian I should live a life in the world, but not of the world. I was taught at church to show kindness to others as a way of showing Christ's love on earth. Every Christian I met, myself included, concluded that God can do no wrong, and everything he does is perfect, just, and correct. My parents, my schools, and my church all made me think that the Bible contains a perfect, kind, and objective moral code in the example of Jesus, in the Ten Commandments, and in the example of Yahweh, and that in order to live a good life, one must follow these rules. Of course, that meant that generally all Christians were good, or trying to be good, and that all unbelievers were addicted to their sin and debauchery and needed to be saved from it. Once in Sunday school, we were all told the story of the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, where a good and righteous holy man called Lot one day met two angels in the form of physical men, and being the good host that he was, he insisted that the angels stayed in his house, rather than in the square. My children's Bible explained that the angels tell Lot that the Lord is angry with the town for its sinful ways, and that judgment is coming and his family will be safe if only they flee and do not look back. An appreciative Lot gathers his family and belongings and flees, but Lot's wife, who apparently had her doubts, despite the angel's warning not to look, glanced back over her shoulder and the Lord killed her for her disobedience by turning her into a pillar of salt. The moral story is obvious. God punishes evil towns with weapons of mass destruction and kills men, women, children and animals, and anyone who doesn't do exactly what he says. The next page of the children's Bible skips merrily on to another story and misses out what happens before or after, passages that even as a Christian I never took any notice of when I read them. Whilst I was deconverting, someone suggested to me to go back and reread the story, and what I read horrified me. Whilst the angels were staying with Lot, an angry mob gathered outside Lot's door, as they'd seen the male angels were pretty and they wanted to have sex with them. They asked Lot to give up his guests to the angry mob to be raped. Lot had a few choices. No doubt the angels could probably look after themselves and kick the mob's asses. But Lot thought quickly and decided instead to offer up his young, defenceless, virgin daughters to be raped, humiliated and abused by the mob. Good choice there, holy man. After fleeing, Lot's newly deflowered daughters presumably got a taste for sexual intercourse, and together they got Lot drunk and had sex with him. I wonder why this wasn't in the children's Bible. Is there some moral to this story? If there is, it's that rape, incest, and indiscriminate slaughter are encouraged and perfectly acceptable if performed either by God or by people doing it for God's will. There are many stories like this in the Bible, in which God explicitly commands that women captured in wartime should be checked for signs of virginity and then either slaughtered or kept as sexual slaves. And whilst the God of the Bible explicitly commands us not to kill, he wrote it in stone, it's perfectly acceptable for God to kill people himself, like Lot's wife. And this is where it regularly goes wrong for the true followers of the Lord. If you feel that God is asking for a test of your loyalty, what are you going to do? What if that test involves killing your own son? Such a test has happened before. For me, if I felt God was asking me to do such a thing, I would say no, and prefer to go to hell than to go through the motions of such a grisly loyalty test. I remember sitting in Sunday school learning to revere Abraham's faith, that he was prepared to go through with the sacrifice, rather than looking at the incident for what it is. In 2004, a Christian woman with postpartum depression, to the tune of the hymn "He Touched Me," cut off her baby's arms. Now who's to say that she shouldn't be revered like Abraham and her baby like Isaac? When I was 17 years old, the pastor of our church decided to tell us all that he was leaving for a bigger and more prosperous church in Brighton. He had found our congregation a replacement minister, and that God had told him that we all had to accept her as his replacement. However, due to the church's constitution, a vote was required. The vote was due to happen that same night, and all baptised church members, including me, had an eligible vote. I attended the evening voting service and watched as our pastor delivered his message, effectively ordering us to vote for his friend, his replacement. His face was red, and his disdain towards the democratic process was obvious. I watched as many people did not place a vote, presumably shocked by the aggression. I filled in my vote and abstained. The vote passed in favour of his replacement. But what happened next was incredible. The pastor stood up at the front of the entire congregation and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He shouted at everybody and then pointed at me. I stood up, and he screamed at me, saying that I was the reason that revival had not come to the church. He pointed to the church tea lady, who was now crying, and then back at me and said, "This is all your fault." He did this right in front of my parents, and as I looked to them for support, they just turned their faces away. Sometime during my family's radicalization, my parents had chosen loyalty to our crazy cult leader instead of me. I exclaimed, "What did I do to deserve that?" He simply said that I was disobedient, in reference to Hebrews 13:7, "Obey your leaders and submit to their authority." Well, we left quickly, and I went back to my parents' home, and my girlfriend, later my wife, came back with me. My parents were visibly shocked and upset by what had happened, but they offered me no words of kindness, and when I tried to discuss things with them, they turned away. I was 17 years old and still heavily reliant on my parents. It was clear to me from this day that they did and still do love me, but their love and consideration for me ends where their religion begins. And they believe that their church leaders, fallible human beings, are inspired by or speaking on behalf of God, and what the leaders say must be followed at any cost. I have no doubt that if the pastor wished me to be made homeless at this point, my parents would have sided with him and thrown me out of home. Since deconverting myself as an adult, I know some other people who have effectively been excommunicated for becoming atheists, or for being gay, or for embracing values which Scripture finds immoral for no good reason other than God says so. Fortunately for these people, their parents are not following all their Scripture literally, as they haven't yet been stoned to death. Such is the control that some religious communities have, and people allow themselves to be controlled in this way, believing that their objective biblical morality requires obedience to authority and conformance to Scripture above all else. I could see my mother was especially torn up about this. She had to choose between her only son and, via a human leader acting as her proxy, her God. I got the feeling that everyone present saw the pastor for who he was, a conniving trickster, although due to the immense control that he had over individual members in the congregation, nobody dared say so, and in my naivety I was the only one questioning him at the time. And when I read, a couple of years ago when I deconverted, about Stephen Weinberg's quotation from the New York Times, I felt that profound feeling in my stomach. He said, "With or without religion, you would have good people doing good things, and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion." If you are a Christian, there are a few questions you should consider to yourself as honestly as you can. Do you think that God speaks to people today? Do you believe that you should do anything that God asks you to do, even if it contradicts laws in the Old Testament? If you felt that God was asking you to take your child or someone whom you love dearly and slice their throat while they watched you, and then burn them, would you do it? If not, why not? I have much more to say on this subject, and will continue this topic in another video. The moral of this story is that God is not good, and allowing others to do your thinking for you, or attempting to rationalise Bronze Age and medieval ethical values into what is acceptable in today's modern world, doesn't work. It is dangerous, and it can harm things that really matter, like your family, your relationships, and cause you to see the world in black and white, us against them, right and wrong. A biblical moral framework will cause you to pull against human nature instead of working with it. It'll make you feel constantly guilty for normal human behaviour, and blind you to honest self-reflection. The truth is, kindness, empathy, and the golden rule is innate within all of us, of doing unto others as you would wish them to do unto you.